Good morning, my friends in the British Isles. I just watched a very short part of, I don't know how long the production might be, but I watched um, a very popular politician talking about uh, making some progress with the problems in the British Isles and necessarily beyond if any progress at all. But it was a matter of, right away talking about, that the Brits must not be harmed by the extreme cost of failure in Europe. Uh, I've heard that before. No different from Billy Graham years ago in America. Any popular politician who strongly or successfully tries to leverage hatred or animosity or resentment or whatever will end up on the trash heap just like Hitler. Nothing could be more true than that the British need a mandate and that someone should be able to utilize a mandate shared one way or another or more or less than before or later on. A lot of common sense. I don't mind people bearing down on common sense, but I want to make a polemical observation. The semantics are debatable enough. The semantics of a polemical perspective. But in this case, I want specifically to say that I'm not bothered by events in the street. Any street, normally. Well, I know, yeah, you can be robbed, you can be assaulted, you can be run over. All kinds of terrible things can happen in the street. There again, also, there's a semantics involved also, but polemically, therefore, I would say I'm not so bothered by the events in the street as I am by the insidious polemics and semantics, rather removed from the desolation and chaos in any streets in the British Isles or anywhere else. What bothers you more, a patriotic dozen of bagpipes in the street, or people banging on pots and pans in the street? Something nobody's chosen to do in many generations. Some people remember the days of Agent Orange in the streets of far-flung places. All kinds of coded messages in terms of semantics or polemics or whatever. What bothers me more than what happens in the streets is what causes, what promotes, what tolerates one thing or another in the street, or fails to encourage one thing or another in the street. What bothers me is that we haven't, I think, quite taken advantage of all our media, all our prowess, technically, to put things in the street, as it were, however you define that, and gosh, there are many definitions. In the street, in the public discourse or dialogue, or the affairs of citizenship, rather than being bothered by things in the street, we should be bothered, I think, by things that are not in the street that are responsible somehow for what happens in the street. You know, there's a myth that in ancient times, somewhat not quite ancient, but in a while back, people would have a slop bucket or something upstairs, you know, and that periodically some servant would throw the contents out into the street, and you had better watch out or it might land on you if you happen to be walking along on cobblestones or what. Well, of course, you know, that's more myth than reality, but it speaks to something, nevertheless, doesn't it? It's a durable story. Well, if what goes on behind closed doors nevertheless utilizes a window of opportunity to throw garbage in the street, then I think we have some rethinking to do. No, it's a political, or if you will, it is a polemical choice. You know, it's like shifting gears with your transmission. You put yourself into a gear called polemics. And you express yourself. Then, if need be, you shift to reverse, or first, or second, or seventh, or eighth. I don't know. We have to teach people how to think. That can be done in the street. In fact, as a matter of fact, I'm terribly bothered by 10-lane highways and all that goes with it. And I feel like saying, the engineers of terrible cars, such as the notorious popular electric car that people envy or what? That all bothers me terribly, as much as what I've referred to that bothers me really removed from the streets. Because, you know, there's a terrible relationship between the chaos in the streets and the chaos in boardrooms or in the Foreign Office or whatever. You know, one cannot be, I think, truly indifferent to 10-lane highways being tolerated far too much. It's because of some things I think neurology can explain about comfort zones and all kinds of things. So all that bothers me. There's hardly room, you know, I mean, looking at the percentages, how much of what goes on in the streets involves something that should bother one in a sense that, that maybe Farage meant when he was so glib. But I'm being polemical here to make a point. Farage is not only glib, he's also successful. He's not only successful, but dangerous. Anybody, say, for example, dealing with nuclear energy is dealing with danger. And safeguards are expensive. And if Farage doesn't know that, let's hope that we find out before he's in public office. The same as with the next elections in the United States at one level or another. Let's hope we find out. You know, let's hope that we separate the wheat from the chaff, hick, hike, hoke, whatever, I don't know. I'm not a public speaker. That doesn't mean that what I say is some sort of secret domain where people who are public might never be found, and vice versa. But anyway, what if I said something about his remarks in some mode other than the polemic? I would say, right on. I'm bothered by what's in the street, meaning, if people are burning cars and bashing heads in the street, I'm not for that. But when you consider all the streets, let's face it, that's a tiny amount, no matter how magnified in media, by media, whatever. So yes, polemically, that is, to make a point, I would say I'm more worried about what takes place privately than what takes place publicly. Now then, there's a feedback that has begun, like feedback on a microphone. People know what a noise that is. There is feedback now, a terrible loop between public and private. People have talked favorably of public and private combinations for good. Well, I could get into that if you'd like, but I don't think I will be prompted. My door is not open for persuasion, the way you've assaulted me indirectly by means of robots, intermediaries, whatever. However, I do pay attention to the media, and I think that there's a problem when we get into this business of public and private. But then there's something else we have to talk about, and that's not the ship of state. That's fine. You can talk about trimming out, beating a path, any number of things. But nowadays we can think in terms of aviation and realize that command authority on an airplane is like command authority in an economy or a culture or a community. It takes coordinated effort. Now, some aircraft are so complicated that there has to be fly-by-wire with computers to translate inputs on the flight deck into counterintuitive combinations by control surfaces and so on. But we've got to have that. You have to have some sort of coordinated efforts on an ongoing basis. You can't build an automatic pilot to run a culture or an economy or anything else. There are those who think, well, the thing to do is to just hammer out any risk in an economy or a culture in a kind of whack-a-mole game. Well, an economy conceived of that way is pathetic. I know one very famous and provocative man who talks about, well, there's something wrong with this idea of anti-monopolistic wisdom, because actually people ought to seek to monopolize their corner of the economy or something. Well, now, that reminds me of a famous man known in the South anyway, Hugo Black, who told delightful stories of challenging, particularly you would say maybe the junior high level in America, with the First Amendment. The First Amendment says there shall be no law against free speech. And so how in the world do you justify anti-libel or this or that, to say nothing of these anal retentive, or what is the phrase that best describes some of the people tempting everybody to go along with Susan Payne. And they would go wild trying to explain, as best they could, that there are exceptions. And he would say, how can you justify that exception? Where is it written that there's an exception to the terms of the First Amendment? And they would get busy thinking. They would. He said they would think and try for things, and then usually, he'd only do that on a one-off basis, with any particular group. But toward the end, he would explain how things fit into place, and they would somehow be greatly relieved. And they also learned a lesson about experience and about helpful old folks. there's something else to be learned, and that is helpful old folks have to learn, dare I say, what it's all about. What it's all about is enabling young people to use all their energy and goodwill to make up for the dwindling abilities of old folks. What dwindles is not necessarily the most valued parts of growing old, just as the energy, if not the brute force, of young people is not the most valuable thing that they offer, which is, I would say, if not a clean slate, then something very close to it. And young people are ill-served or disrespected by those who cannot, for example, explain what dialectic is, what polemic is, indirect, diplomatic, or straight and decisive. People of any age who find it easier to be decisive are, I would say, due for some scrutiny. You know, right now there are people that we could all talk about who seem very decisive. Shouldn't we be a little careful about the kaleidoscopic characteristics of reality? And that includes our own perspective, which we can change one way or another to a degree. To a degree. What is reality? Some say, well, there's this big difference between a theory and reality. Well, of course, anybody who's a diesel mechanic maintaining wonderful old Detroit diesel buses to people coming up with particle-driven spacecraft can wonder at the idea someone had before the diesel-powered GM buses began rolling. That must have been one hell of an idea. Still is. And some people know that. But that doesn't mean that orbital mechanics can't offer something to solve problems that some people can't solve by renting golf courses for the, assisted living, who are treading with tanks on occasion, and a kind of a version of historic reruns or symbolic special effects. The tank has to be reinvented. You know, I've talked about that in terms of superior technologies, and by that I don't mean that tanks should be able to hold maybe half a day's worth of fuel and nowhere to go with a 1,000 horsepower turbine, but to get stuck in a ravine. I've seen the tapes. Others have. They're common. You know, putting a turbine in a tank is not progress, despite what people have said. I also revisited fairly often for some reason, the idea of turbine-powered cars that don't meet environmental priorities. We're not much beyond that in some things being offered now, if you look at the big picture. Nevertheless, I can remember there was a village called Mountain Brook Village, a small city where I was, and they showed up uncommonly often. The reason that was true is because of buying power. Where I happened to go in for ketchup and hamburger or what, hamburger buns because of, or do something, to feed my face. And around me, these turbo cars, or some famous double R fare, and who can cut the mustard in the back of a Rolls Royce? Well, almost by definition, few would. But there was much talk about that in the ads back then. I was content, to notice these, and no one took offense the way they learned later took offense when I was not bowled over by meeting all kinds of people. I can't say some of them are still alive. They're not going to tell. But while they were there, I'll never really quite understand, except that in retrospect, I understand a lot that isn't worth reiterating or anything like that. Certainly the people involved know that, but yes, I will take a levering mode, leveraging mode with bright and shining star in Britain about values. And of course, one thing I would say is that, there's a symptom involved here about leverage. This business about we shouldn't, he says, quote, we shouldn't, suffer the burdens done by the UK to, common sense? Is that a quote or something? It's a paraphrase. And that's one step away from, the Billy Graham kind of leverage. Not to say Hitler, that's a cliche to talk about Hitler. So I'll mention Billy Graham. People know what the hell. He was about hate, just like Hitler. I think the Brits are beyond that. I think the despair is that people know too well some of the factors that figure into their troubles. And Farage is willing not to say, well, if we get out of Brexit, or rather, if we get out of the European Union, we will benefit to the tune of 350, the story goes, or 300 million pounds per month to redirect. Lies like that are not punishable in a court of law because it's politics. So you better be careful when people can be that irresponsible. And I wouldn't want any demagogue to get a head start the way Hitler did. Now, there's something to be said about Billy Graham. He did not get a head start on, a terribly dire situation. What he did was discover for himself that, if he goes this way or that, and what led him into, leveraging hate was the fact that it proved successful. I wouldn't want that same lesson to prove successful in Britain, or you'll end up with what, Robespierre or something? We're wondering about that in the U.S. now, when both health issues and security issues mean that we have to disarm kids of their cell phone. Well, I'm glad to say that in the nick of time, Nick might not be just in time, someone in Rome has right away said, to hell with that. Present people with something better at any age and let them choose it. Don't remove choice instead. Well, I won't even get started on that, but I say it's the same way with grown-ups who can't make choices, or what, in the opinion of some, shouldn't be allowed to make choices, or some who provocatively say, listen up, entrepreneurs, should you really want to have a monopoly? And it's amazing how people self-identify. They will tattoo themselves for future reference. Never mind all that. There's also some proof in terms of choices. There was at one time a man named Ford, and he learned how to build cars. And eventually he was so powerful, he ran up against a choice that was obvious for Standard Oil. Either diversify as best you can or be broken up, however many ways might prove best. Standard Oil was broken up. Ford was not broken up. One of the reasons was he privately, semi-privately, whatever you want to say, he privately invested millions and millions and millions in companies that grew to be competitive in his industry. And for that reason, he was not broken up. But not everything was discussed publicly. Why tire people out with all of that when you're not talking about something that rises to the honorable level of the public interest in favor of the entire economy? It's sort of like this, in the legal system, theoretically, things move up a chain of authority, if need be, for decision making. We've had a short circuit. Pygmies who are more worried about their reversal rates than much else tend to send stupid questions to a stupid final determination. It's the same in public discourse. Many things can be handled administratively in a healthy way so that true questions of interest are solved in the streets to the extent that people can vote on issues, either in terms of providing a mandate or in referenda. It's all scrambled up now, and private interest now would, I think, be about straightening out all the mess. And for one thing, that means straightening out all the media. Now, we have some laws against monopolies or untoward events, say in the manufacture of goods or something. We've had less success on the matter of services. We used to have laws about, say, for example, the ownership of TV stations by newspapers in a given area. How quaint, if you think about that, how quaint. But you can see what they were talking about back then. Well, that's changed now, and a lot of things have changed, but a lot of the changes people kind of understand, Something's wrong. Yeah, you betcha. A lot's wrong. But we can't just go chopping up companies until no company to speak of is large enough to buy a cup of coffee or a new ballpoint pen. They have to line up in a lounge or somewhere and maybe be given a pen, and by then it's too late. But what I'm saying is, things can be rejuvenated and not with some sort of condescension that, uh, well, I could name again the people I know who have a certain uh, wrong impression, a simplistic, stupid impression of lessons learned by such great figures as Rudy Valley and some others of his generation who learned firsthand the amazing power of modern communication. People learned back then what he learned, and yet some didn't seem to uh, learn very well. Now we have another era and we have a new situation. It's more than just the internet because of interlocking factors that need to be examined. It has to do with new opportunities beyond broadcasting per se. And people have talked about how narrowcasting is part of it. Yes, it is. But we now see some people, their heads are turned by their success toward mentors who are phony. Some, though, are not, and that's the beauty of the system now, where many can try their hand at content production beyond those who would mentor them. Many, I think, have discovered, oh my gosh, look what we're really doing. But they haven't turned bad because of their insight. In fact, they have even more to say. Some do, not all. But in any event, we have a new frontier, and that's the way it is. We don't just have 3 stations across the whole of the United States for what we would now regard as simple television. But we are in a tumultuous time in a way people, historians might think, about the land of Missouri. Well, it was so rough and tumble that it was really very dangerous. But it was a kind of danger that everybody understood. It was not as though they all felt that there was some cosmic power that put them in Missouri for them to wonder whether existence is just a mirage. They felt that they were able to act on their own behalf. I think some people wanted some despicable outcomes, but others did not want that. And I'll tell you a personal story. I've mentioned it before, and that is walking through a nondescript, boring civil rights battleground and seeing tombstones from men from Indiana, for example, if you think about it. Where I was, and they died where I was walking, to think they would put down their farm activities and come all the way there to die for an idea. Well, now, do we have any really great ideas these days? I hope that I might come across some. I hope they're better than that kind of sacrifice, which was heroic, but doesn't need sanctimonious time-wasting reflection and navel-gazing. Still, when you think about it, I'm not a fan of, what people do with dead bodies. I think cremation one good example of progress that people can make. It's easier to do now than it was many years ago in America. But that notwithstanding, what was an old-fashioned burial with a tombstone really tugged at me. Realized somebody would leave his farm. I think of somebody I know in Pennsylvania, actually two farmers up there, to think that they would put down what they were doing to go fight in Tennessee for an idea. Well, it turns out the idea was not for a better mousetrap or, for a 380 European Union airplane. It was for a kind of citizenship back then that I'm sure many people couldn't really easily imagine. And even today, many can't. But people are not doing much of what was done then. Now, in Great Britain, there was a time when borders were thought unfair in the UK as well as other European countries, or is England not a European country? There's some argument about that and whether Russia is European and on and on. But yes, it was wrong to think that you could tempt the entire world with media and handheld technology that would let them know that they were being cheated in the same way that other slaves are cheated. You want to talk about wage slavery, or is that off limits? Well, it's not off limits. Meanwhile, some people tried to take over some scribblings from Great Britain about problems in running an economy. They tried to, pick up something, and with their own sleazy, thuggish ways, they did no better than people around me today. We can safely say that communism was stupid. And as it was defined by any number, it will always be stupid. There are stupid people. And if presented with choices, they might present, with stupid agreement. I mean, there are those who walk down the candy aisle in the supermarket and choose for themselves junk food. There are others who sometimes nowadays have to walk all the way back to the back of a store to get milk or any other healthy foods, although people argue about the health or bad health of milk and on. But the point is, there's some people who buy some things in a supermarket, and there are other people who buy junk food. And the sad thing is, a store like that is mainly subsidized or kept afloat by the larger profits on junk food than on good food. In other words, the candy aisle or whatever does the heavy lifting for the supermarket, and the profit margins on the really good stuff are very low. They're very competitive. In fact, they're price supports for some of them. Does that mean we ought to just shut down the supermarket and have price supported food sold in government-run stores and and the only stores that would be free market would be disallowed from selling candy and could only sell, if not those things supported by subsidies, like dairy products and certain other products, um, than things that are allowed by some bureaucracy. Yeah. Well, so far, the markets and everybody have agreed we'll just go ahead and have a supermarket. And if people want to choose junk food, they can. And if people want to walk all the way or ride in their wheelchairs all the way to the back of the store, they can pick up some things that are given price supports, even though there's an industry with column inches and Technicolor saying don't drink milk, or if you do, take out the food value and drink something, and then we'll repackage the stuff that we took out of the milk and sell it to you as something that we recommend instead, or whatever. Well, the world out there deserves some attention by educators, and they turn out to be too often they turn out to be uninformed. I'll put it that way. What's that saying? If you can't do something, then you can teach, preach, or bury. You can become a teacher, a preacher, or an undertaker. Let's hope that's only a joke. Meanwhile, it's not a joke. I've talked too long, well past 40 minutes, and I started out just wanting to say something about, this business of leverage, dialectical or polemical leverage, having to do with being bothered. I guarantee you I've been more than simply bothered by those who mistreat me, and they are insidious and unknown to people who ought to find out about them in their own lives, if not in anybody else.